This is the Shoot at the Hip podcast. And what this podcast is going to be focused on is professional wrestling. Anybody that knows me, and for those that don't, I am a big time wrestling fan. I have been watching wrestling since I can remember. My first wrestling match that I can remember watching on television was actually a VHS. For those that probably don't know what a VHS is, VHS is a tape that used to be put in a VCR. So that goes to tell you how old I am right there. But the first one I watched was on Coliseum Video, WrestleMania 6, Hulk Hogan versus Ultimate Warrior, Sky Dome, Toronto, Canada, was one of the first wrestling matches that I can remember watching, and that really made me fall in love with professional wrestling. I was privileged to grow up with my uncles, and my uncles and I were kind of close in age. My uncles and I probably maybe like 5 and 6 years apart, respectively. And on Saturdays, we used to go outside and we used to play basketball, and we'll be outside all day. And around 5:05 Central Standard Time, we would go inside to watch WCW Saturday Night. And that became a ritual, man. And I fell in love with wrestling since then. And I wanted to do this Shoot at the podcast because, honestly, man, I talk about a lot of things. I talk about general topics, but I never really focus on wrestling. And I think that I should, because I am a big-time wrestling fan, and I think I know quite a bit about wrestling. The fact that I can really sit up here and talk to you all, and I think that I can make some sense out of a situation. Now, I'm not one of those people that think that I'm always right. And for those out there that think that they're always right, I mean, get a life, man, honestly. Just get a life. If you're talking about wrestling on YouTube or any other pod channel like iTunes or Spreaker or whatever, and you just think that you're so right, man, get a life. And understand that people do have opinions, and I'm not saying that I'm going to be right about the things that I say, but it's my truth and it's my opinion. And I'm interested to know what you all think about, some of the topics that I come up with. I'm going to be focusing on professional wrestling, of course, but I'm going to be focusing also on particular wrestlers. And I'm going to talk about different wrestlers that I knew throughout my lifetime, and I'm going to focus on them. So it's going to be like 5-10 minute, probably little dialogue about wrestlers that I like, ones that I don't like, things that I feel like needs to be fixed with that particular wrestler if they still are wrestling today, and what went wrong with some of the wrestlers that no longer wrestle or probably no longer with us. The first wrestler I want to talk about is Bret Hart. I'm a huge Bret Hart fan. Bret Hart is exactly the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. I mean, he lived by that moniker. I mean, he actually was it. The best technical wrestler of all time in my book. Bret Hart is the blueprint of what technical wrestling is all about. And I want to talk about Bret Hart because Bret Hart, over the past couple of years, in my opinion, has become absolutely miserable, man. Bret Hart, it seems like every time he goes on somebody's podcast or somebody's radio show, he's always bashing Eric Bischoff. He's always bashing WCW. He's always talking about the Montreal Screwjob, and it's pretty sad, man, because Bret Hart, I guess he's probably like in his late 50s, maybe even in his 60s, and you look back, and I remember I was watching something on social media on the other day, and it came to me, and I was shocked when I seen this, but it's been 20 years since the Montreal Screwjob. Survivor Series 1997 has been 20 years, man. Wow. The first thing I thought about was, man, I'm old. But it just made me think about Bret Hart, man, and how sad he is. And I look at Bret Hart, and it seems like, even though he's in his late 50s, he looks like he's about 80. And every time, you put a mic in front of his face, he's talking about how people treated him. And, Bret Hart, it has been great to professional wrestling. I mean, we watched some of the things that Bret Hart did. I mean, one of his greatest matches, in my opinion, was against his brother Owen in a steel cage match. SummerSlam, I think that's what it was. Those two tore the house down, man. They wrestled for about almost like 45 minutes, and you forgot they were in a steel cage match. And Bret Hart has great matches with the British Bulldog, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Shawn Michaels, Ric Flair. The list goes on and on. And I feel like because it seems like everybody wants to talk about the Montreal Screwjob, he gives them the benefit of the doubt. He gives them the ammunition to talk about it. And I feel like Bret Hart gets swept under the rug because of it. And it's sad because you spend most of the interviews, you listen to him talking about the Montreal Screwjob, you hear him talking about Shawn Michaels, Vince McMahon, and you don't really hear him talk about some of those classic matches. And if you do, you only talk about them for like 5 minutes. Most of the interview are just talking about how he left and went to WCW and how he didn't like Eric Bischoff and Eric Bischoff was dumb and nobody understood him. And it's just sad, man, just to watch Bret Hart like that. You look at Shawn Michaels, a guy who, played a role in the Montreal Screwjob. You look at Triple H. These guys do interviews, and you rarely even hear them talk about it. And then when they do talk about it, they probably want to talk about it for like 5 minutes. But Bret Hart, it just seems like he just cannot let that go, and it's just sad, man. And this is just a prime example of when individuals allow their past just to eat away at them, and they become unhappy, and they just become bitter. And it just seems like he just has some kind of personal vendetta against Triple H. And every time I see him talking about Triple H, he says that Triple H can't wrestle and he only can wrestle when there's a stipulation. Look, man, I'm not here to talk about that, man. I'll talk about Triple H on another edition of the show. But just listening to Bret Hart talk, you can tell it's not really any facts behind it. It just seems like he just does it for shock value, and it just comes from a bitter place. I just have a message for Bret Hart, and I'm probably sure that Bret Hart got better things to do than to listen to me. But I just wish that Bret Hart just gets himself together, man, and realize that, one day, he's going to shut his eyes, and you don't want your legacy just to be remembered by the Montreal Screwjob. You want to be remembered as being one of the greatest in-ring performers of all time. Was Bret Hart the greatest talker on the mic? Absolutely not. But when he stepped between those ropes, it was go time. And no matter who he was in a ring with, Bret Hart always put on a 5-star match. In my opinion, I never remembered Bret Hart having a bad match. Maybe I was too young to understand what was really going on. I'm pretty sure people probably around my age now who probably watch Bret Hart probably would have their opinions about having bad matches. But as far as I'm concerned, Bret Hart was the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. And it's sad that he's walking around here and doing these interviews and people are not even asking him about, what he did in the ring long enough. They only want to talk about WCW and, and the whole Montreal Screwjob thing. Bret Hart, you are the best. But I just feel like when you do these interviews, you need to really start talking about your legacy and leave that Montreal Screwjob stuff alone. It's been 20 years. 20 years since the Montreal Screwjob. And honestly, Bret, I think it's time to move on.